a teacher, a friend, a sorcerer. Gojo Satoru was a lot of things to a lot of people, but the one thing he was to everyone was the strongest. A being that stepped beyond the bounds of what was thought possible, and someone who entered a domain that only he and Sukuna could reach. A place completely isolated from those around him, thrusting him into a role that he had no control over nor desire to change. And although Gojo was able to meet his end at the hands of a sorcerer capable of connecting to his strength and being humanized in his passing, Chapter 261 has brought back into question Gojo's position in this story. Is Satoru Gojo merely a tool, a weapon to be wielded whenever threats become too great? Or is he a person, someone that could be related to by his students and peers, a person that could be a friend to those who surrounded him, a person that wasn't just limited to being the strongest? To say that Gojo is not framed as a weapon or tool within the story wouldn't be something that is wholly accurate due to the nature of his occupation, but this doesn't necessarily deny him his humanity or connection to those around him. The act of being a sorcerer is a dehumanizing one. It's a job that requires you to be inundated with trauma on a regular basis and not allow it to affect your mindset lest you lose focus in the heat of battle and die. Even the most regular and well-adjusted sorcerers you can think of have some aspect of themselves that would be considered quite strange when truly thought about. Nanami being capable of compartmentalizing the killing of transfigured humans quicker than Itadori is a prime example of this fact. As far as competent sorcerers go, Nanami is as close to normal as it gets, with Kusakabe really being the only other contender in the story, and even he is immediately able to sidestep the moral issue of killing these creatures that were once human for the sake of taking down an even greater, more prominent threat. It pains Nanami to do so much so that his soul wavers visibly in front of Mahito, but he still has the capacity for this practical and cold rationality. Yuji's bleeding hard early in the manga is actually the more normal reaction in this scenario, as any normal person would shirk the responsibility of ending another's life. This is why Yuji becoming capable of killing transfigured humans towards the tail end of the arc is so important for his character and development within the world of Jujutsu, because doing that is specifically a very sorcerer-like action. Sorcerers, as have been demonstrated throughout the entire manga, have weird outlooks, morals, philosophies, and coping mechanisms relative to your typical non-sorcerer because the nature of their work demands it. The more naturally normal you are, the less likely you are to see success in this field, and this leads to many of them having weird quirks, beliefs, or oddities about them. Megumi only cares to save those who he views as good people. Nobara is willing to risk her life as a sorcerer simply to live in Tokyo. Todo determines a sorcerer's worth based on their type in women. Yuta views an insult to his friends as a greater slight than the potential murder of all non-sorcerers. No matter where you look in Jujutsu society, you'll find some real craziness that is exclusive to it, and Gojo himself makes note of this insanity because of its helpfulness in coping with a sorcerer lifestyle, as you not only risk your life every time you step into the world to exercise a curse, but the very nature of these exorcisms acts as one measly tick in a clock that spans an eternity. Insignificant and imperceptible on its own, but just like a cog, endlessly important to the continued function of the whole system. The balance between these forces of cursed energy is constantly in flux, and it is the duty of a Jujutsu sorcerer to maintain it to the best of their abilities. They are tools to be used, public servants of the supernatural world, and as the pinnacle of sorcery, it's no surprise that Gojo also exists within this very system of objectification. To be a sorcerer is to be a cog. To be the strongest sorcerer is to be the strongest cog, a weapon to be wielded against cursed spirits and curse users, yet very few people question the humanity of any other character in the story. It's specifically Gojo that garners these questions from the viewer, and for good reason. While themes of isolation and objectification exist for all key players in the story, it is much more prominent in Gojo's personal journey than many others because he pushes their existence to its extreme. Not to the degree that Sukuna does, nor in the same manner, as Sukuna seems to have discarded concepts like love and connection altogether, but quite different from the rest of the main cast all the same. While Sukuna has also carried the title of the strongest for the entirety of his existence, he differs so much from Satoru because he lacks accountability accountability and responsibility for his actions. Down to the very core of his being, Sukuna is selfish, he's fiendish, he's a monster in the most blatant sense of the word, so his strength exists for nothing more than to affirm himself and achieve his desires. He's strong because he's Sukuna. He's Sukuna because he's strong. To himself, those two things are all that matter and all that he's ever intended to be, and unlike Gojo, he has no qualms with wielding this power completely selfishly. Sukuna is a calamitous force that up until now has only destroyed for the sake of his enjoyment, not to build, not to uplift, and certainly not to love. Like a tornado or earthquake, all Sukuna can do is destroy everything that exists in his wake. This isn't true for Gojo, and the contradiction of existing as someone capable of having it all while choosing not to for the sake of a larger goal is what makes Gojo the character that he is. Because he has a heart, because he cares about those around him, because he has aspirations that lie beyond the simple catharsis of acting on his base impulses, he is forcefully transformed into something that exists oxymoronically. He hasn't committed himself to becoming nothing more than a cog like Itadori, but he also doesn't have the ruthless and fiery passion for destruction and ego like Sukuna. So from a societal perspective, Gojo is just viewed as a means to an end. Conversely, while we see that his humanity isn't in tatters in the same way that Sukuna's is, we are also privy to the fact that Gojo isn't exactly like every other sorcerer in the story, especially the characters that we consider to be on the relative good side of it all. Yuji, Megami, Nobara, Yuta, Maki, and all of Gojo's students and fellow sorcerers have someone to rely on and pass their burdens to if theirs becomes too heavy. Being a sorcerer means that one's burdens will be passed on in death or in loss, but what does that mean to Gojo? Someone who was thought incapable of dying, incapable of losing. The marathon of sorcery has been viewed as a relay race for everyone, a journey that can be continued even in death, because so long as the baton is passed, the story can continue and the race might eventually be completed. For Gojo, many believe that this marathon should be run alone, a race with no assistance, a race with no allies, a race with no teammates, with no hopes of ever ending because of Gojo's strength and ability. In the face of Haibara's death, we see in Hidden Inventory that Nanami puts these unspoken wishes into words, blatantly calling for Gojo to bear the weight of Jujutsu on his shoulders alone, to make him a weapon that has no need for a wielder, to make the lives of everyone around him easier. Much of the story characterizes Gojo as that, or shows that that is his role, much like many other sorcerers have roles in the story. A part of Gojo certainly relishes this challenge and accepts it, a fan of Jujutsu, a fan of combat, a fan of improvement, but another massive part of him acknowledges the impossibility of this prolonged existence, which is why at the end of this arc he decides that he needs to foster a generation of sorcerers capable of running this marathon alongside him. Speaking of Hidden Inventory, this arc does a really good job of putting this concept on display for all, as there are multiple different points in this arc where Gojo's humanity is highlighted and then immediately undercut by the blinding light of his strength. Many people have interpreted Gojo's actions or lack thereof as heartless or devoid of humanity, and even I myself have fallen into this trap before, but Gojo's care for Riko Amanai during the duration of the bounty, his connection to Geto, and heartbreak when Geto leaves all act in direct opposition to that interpretation. Riko, a snobby, annoying kid he just met, is someone that he's willing to exhaust himself over and potentially even clash with Jujutsu society as a whole if it helps protect her and her youth. This genuine display of humanity is immediately undercut by Gojo's awakening, a moment where it would have been entirely reasonable to hate Toji and have vengeance on his mind. Yet Gege goes out of his way to show us that this isn't the case. He isn't mad about Riko, and in fact, in his rematch against Toji, he feels euphoric, absolutely elated and consumed by the greatness of himself and the world around him. From this, you could feel that Gojo is strictly a monster or person who doesn't care about those around him, but I don't think it's so simple. This lack of simplicity demonstrates itself the best at two key points in the series, arguably the most iconic, hotly debated, and important parts of Jujutsu Kaisen, at least for Gojo's own characterization, namely his separation from Suguru Geto and his defeat at the hands of Ryomen Sukuna. Geto's department from humanity is a really interesting moment, not only for Geto, but for Gojo as well, because it highlights the complexity of Gojo's situation more than most chapters do. Geto makes it clear that all of his personal dreams and aspirations could be achieved by Gojo, by his power, insinuating that he has something that could be wielded indiscriminately to get what a person wants. Even special grades such as himself and Yuki don't have the capability to change the structure of the entire world in the way that Satoru does. Geto further drives this point home by straight up telling Gojo that his dreams would become reality if he could become him, not for anything other than his strength, anything other than his ability to stand at the top as the strongest. Even the posing of the infamous question, are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest, continues to get at his identity and how intertwined power and himself truly are. They are inseparable, entangled in such a messy, such a human way that you can't hope to wholly see where one starts and the other ends. This is such an intense and thought-provoking moment for Gojo that he even acknowledges that strength alone isn't enough to save those around him. To achieve what he wants to achieve, to create the world that he wants to exist within, he needs people that are willing to take his hand and join him at the top. And it's my personal belief that it's in this moment he decided to become a teacher, a practitioner of Jujutsu that would bring up students the right way to assuage his loneliness, but to also preserve the childhoods of fellow sorcerers to the best of his ability. That desire to preserve innocence within his students is often an overlooked part of Gojo's character, simply because he's also pretty intense and can have a slack leash with those he teaches, but Gojo has made it explicit that the springtime of youth is a season that he looks back fondly on and wants his kids to be able to as well. In Volume 0, Gojo makes it quite clear that he's willing to challenge the entire world to protect Yuta, largely in part because he's determined to preserve what he calls the best years of Yuta Okotsu's youth. Yuji's premature death due to the meddling of higher-ups genuinely enrages Gojo to the point of being visibly emotional, and it's so out of character for him at this point that even Shoko comments on it and kind of teases him for it. Now, to some extent, I think that this upsetness can be explained by Gojo's affection for Yuji, but even more so, I find this emotional reaction goes beyond just Yuji as an individual, with his death being indicative of something greater, a reminder of why he does what he does and what disgusting, vile, vitriolic, idiotic forces he is trying to overturn through his teachings. Even his care for Megumi is something that goes beyond the individual. I personally disagree with the interpretation that Megumi and Gojo were like father and son respectively, but in extra material made by Gege, it is pretty clear that Gojo was attentive in his upbringing of Fushiguro. Maybe not loving or endearing in the way that you would expect from a parent, as Sumiki took on that role herself, but Gojo didn't not care about Megumi. And I think much of that is due to understanding his overarching goals and what he fights for on top of his pre-existing empathy. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you and say that Gojo is the most empathetic or caring person we see in the story. He definitely has his moments of coldness, but I view that as Gojo just being Gojo, combined with the practicality required for the job. This fact doesn't erase his humanity completely, but I can see how it would diminish it in the eyes of many viewers. This leads directly into chapter 236, arguably the most controversial chapter and death in the entire manga. And regardless of how you feel we got here, I can definitely say that this was an amazing chapter for Gojo's character and directly addresses a lot of the points I've been making in this video. On one hand, you have Nanami and Haibara in Gojo's dreamscape, lightly joking about and even criticizing Gojo's lack of regard for those around him and desire to live exclusively for sorcery. Even Geto pokes fun at this himself, and many people have taken this to be a completely concrete and unarguable interpretation of Gojo's character simply because Nanami said it, but I don't see it as such. Just as Gojo said earlier in this chapter, he felt that those around him were incapable of understanding him because of the immense gap in strength. Nanami's words then mean that this is only what he could grasp from Gojo's actions and his words. Much like the audience, Nanami attempts to force Gojo to fit within the confines of his own understanding of him, rather than acknowledging and realizing the complexity of the human being that stands before him. Is Nanami entirely wrong in his assessment of Gojo? No. Being strong and loving Jujutsu both inform his character quite a bit, but Gojo is not just that. You can't ask a flower to understand you no matter how much love you have for it, because a flower cannot understand the plight of a human. This isn't to say that Gojo saw his students and fellow sorcerers as beneath him, nor did he inherently suffer more than them. It is just to say that the suffering of a flower and the suffering of a human are incomparable. They are doomed to never align, and truly be of one accord. They are doomed to be isolated within their respective categories. Despite that fact, Gojo admits that he loved his students anyway. He admits that he wished Geto could have stood amongst his allies. He admits to wanting to reach Sukuna with his strength. He admits to being more than just the strongest. That title informs his identity in the same way any other trait can inform a person's. A kind person is not just kind, it's simply their most prominent trait, or the one that can be recognized with the least amount of effort. The same rings true for Gojo and his demeanor as the strongest. Even the premise of this video is founded on a false dichotomy, a force either-or situation that can't possibly contain all of the nuance that is Gojo's character. Has Gojo been portrayed and characterized as a weapon of sorcery in Jujutsu Kaisen? Yes. Not only are all sorcerers used in a very pragmatic sense for a supposed greater good to achieve balance, but as the strongest, Gojo has always been the pinnacle of what that means in this story. Is he also a person, a complex human being with the feelings and emotions that are recognized within this manga? Absolutely. And he's also not just a person who has been relegated to being the strongest. In the beginning of the video, I made it clear that Gojo is most widely recognized for that aspect of himself, but I also first highlighted other pieces of his identity: teacher, friend, sorcerer. Gojo is all of these things at the same time because, like every good character, he can't so easily be placed in one isolated category. If you enjoyed this video and want to see my analysis on chapter 261 with Yuta Okkotsu as the focus, click here, and you can also watch this playlist for more character and manga analysis content. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.